Hi, and welcome to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker, and I'm part of the English faculty here at Brookdale Community College, where I co-direct the creative writing program. Today on the show, I'm very excited to be talking to Mihaela Moscaliuc. Mihaela was born and raised in Romania and came to the U.S. in 1996 to work on a PhD in American literature. Her poems, reviews, translations, and articles have appeared widely in national journals like the Georgia Review, Prairie Schooner, Tri-Quarterly, New Letters, and many, many more. Her first book is called Father Dirt and was the winner of the 2008 Gensler Award and published by Alice James Press. She teaches at Monmouth University and in the MFA program at Drew. So Mihaela, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations on the first book coming out. It's a great award. It's a very prestigious award, and I was wondering just what it felt like to win it.
It was an extraordinary feeling, of course. I was very, very excited, and it was very unexpected. And of course, I sent the manuscript out, so I was hoping for some kind of response, some kind of feedback. But I had worked on the manuscript for just 2 years. I came to poetry very, very late. I came to reading poetry very late in my life, to understanding poetry even later, and to writing poetry really when I was working on my doctorate in immigration literature, and that had to do with theory and fiction and nonfiction. I was very, very excited. I can't say more than that.
No, it's great. It's a wonderful
very
thing.
Unexpected and very exciting.
Well, it's wonderful. The book, Father Dirt, I'm wondering, could you kind of describe the work in the book?
Most of the poems are fairly straightforward narratives, and I guess I grew up and lived in a country and at a time when to be truthful and to speak the truth, you had to be elliptical and you had to be very elusive and rely a lot on silences and decode language. And at the time, people were disappeared for a joke. And so narratives are missing from my life. And I know they're old hat in poetry, but they're still fairly new to my psyche. So I feel that for the first time now I can go back to those times and sort of try and make sense of my other life, try and make sense of those experiences. And so the narratives are helping me not only recuperate some of those times, but really make sense of them and kind of order them and bring them into a kind of narrative that can illuminate something about those times that I didn't have the time or didn't have the guts to figure out at the time. So
does it feel freeing to be able to write these narratives at this point? It
does, absolutely, yes. And it's very liberating. And I think writing in English is a second language. Of course, on one hand, it added a layer of difficulty, but at the same time, I think it's also been very liberating. It's brought a certain kind of relief to the project, and life really feels differently. You experience life differently, I think, as an immigrant in a foreign language. So,
well, I know that Kimiko Han, who was one of the reviewers of the book, had talked about you as an emigre poet, and Andrei Curdescu as well had wrote about how your book transfers the weight of one world into the language of another, which is, I think, a gorgeous quote, actually. Is that the role you see yourself in, to a certain extent, as someone translating one culture for another?
At this point, yes. I think of myself as a cultural translator of sorts, and not just for my audience, for the American audience, but a cultural translator for myself. As I mentioned, I'm still trying to figure out those experiences, and because of Romania I knew at the time, and because the Romania I still know is disappearing very, very quickly. Romania is changing tremendously, and with every trip back I had to in a way reconsider my whole life and my whole past, and the Romania of my imagination is vanishing, and I'm terrified of forgetting my past, and I'm terrified of forgetting about those years. One of the mottos in my book is from Milan Kundera, and I might be misquoting him now, but he said that the struggle of men against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And to a certain extent, I think I see myself as a poet, as my role as a poet as custodian of the Romanian past and the Romanian culture, and so I'm trying to, in a way, translate and transport some of those experiences into a new language.
So you're translating on two levels to a certain extent, from your own first language as well as culturally. It's interesting because the first part of the book seems to be they're poems that look back to a childhood to a certain extent, and what you're saying about the idea of I'm translating sort of this country that is disappearing and holding on to it, and the idea of memory, because one of the themes in the book to me seems to be just this sense of moving on in life, and yet at the same time, how do you keep the memory with you? And how do you translate it to a certain extent so that it becomes useful? Was writing the poems about childhood in the first part kind of part of that process for you?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. Yeah, and there in many ways those poems I think have are sort of universal or address universal experiences. They're all initiatory poems, but there's also sometimes even the common language of love or sexual initiation suffers moments of intranslatability. So my project, or what I was trying to do, is make something out of those moments that were resisting, sometimes not translation into English, but cultural translation. Along the lines of I think the first part of your question about
my very long question, yes.
about the childhood. The first part of the book has to do with my childhood in Romania, and as I was finishing the manuscript, actually one of my first readers asked me if I was gonna write my American poems, and she said, "Well, I love what you're doing here with your Romanian life, but where are your American poems? You've been here for 12 years now." And so one of the poems in the book answers that question. It's a direct response to that question. So would you like me to read that?
Sure, I'd love it. Yeah.
It's one of the last poems in the book. And it's called Minds Touched by Happiness Tend to Forget Their Bodies' Sores. And it's in two voices. It's an interior dialogue. How about the last quarter of your life? The extreme chocolate, the fair trade Starbucks he brings to you in bed before slipping back in on Leonard Cohen's No Sinner Need Rise Up Forgiven. How about the warm sheets, the dirty words he brushes on your neck, then licks away so you can replay later while dressing lamb in ginger and rosemary? How about your American garden, the transplanted porcini, hummingbirds disoriented by such profusion of reds? How about his gift of poems and trust, the moon flushed but not with hoary myth, candles, fires? How about your tongue tonight, oyster raw, plump with the salt of matured desire? I am still green, a green plum delayed by prolonged Romanian winters. How about the Christmas our breads burned to ash in the oven? Kneeling in front of the TV, I waited breathless for the Ceausescu's execution. When the firing squad punctured their hearts 100 times and they crumpled like ragged dolls, I wept with happiness. How about that? How about that? I think this poem says a lot about. I'm still trying to deal with so much of the Romanian past and with those years under the communist regime, I'm having a hard time moving forward, I think.
Well, maybe there's 2-3 books in it as well.
Maybe, I hope so.
Well, I noticed it's interesting. I mean, there's quite a few pages of notes at the end of the book as well. And I mean, I think they're thinking of an American audience needed to be quite a bit of explaining, because I'm sure you find readers or readership that doesn't know an awful lot about Romania at the time. And so, I mean, it's interesting. And I was thinking about, if the first section is about childhood, and the third section tends to be your American poems a little bit.
Yes.
But the middle section often is looking at Romani children, street children of the time, and I'm wondering how that section came into being. Were you working with these kids?
I was working for about 4 years, from 1990 to 1994, before I came to the States. I worked for a charity organization, a British charity organization, who started a number of socializing projects in orphanages in northern Romania. And
Socializing projects?
Socializing. They would bring volunteers from all over the world, working for the Body Shop, for the cosmetics company, actually, to the Body Shop Charity Foundation, to work in a number of orphanages and engage, use arts and use sports sometimes, and all kind of things just to help children in orphanages socialize, because the Romanian system, orphanage system, it needs a lot of restructuring right now. Children who are either abandoned by their families or who were taken away under communism from their families and put in orphanages almost never left those institutions. And the school took place. They had their own schools in the orphanage. Very often, these orphanages were in extremely remote areas, and they had absolutely no kind of contact even with the people in the village. And so I worked with these children for about 4 years, and I worked with a number of teenagers who lived on the streets, very often teenagers who had graduated from these orphanages and ended up living on the streets
from that. Well, it's an incredibly powerful section of the book, actually. Well, we need to take a break, so I'll be back. I'm talking with Mihaela Moscaliuc, who is the author of Father Dirt, and please join us after the break.
Here are the low monthly payments and interest rate as we promised. Here's where they triple. The rest of this is really just here so that we get your house when you can't pay us back.
Predatory lenders are never this easy to spot. Call us and protect yourself with the facts.
Hi, and welcome back to the Brookdale Visiting Writer Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker, and I am interviewing Mihaela Moscaliuc, who is the author of the award-winning book called Father Dirt. So, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before the break, we were talking about the different sections in the book, how it starts off sort of with childhood poems, has this shift towards poems that are poems of the street kids and kids in the orphanage, which is really powerful. And kind of then the shift to the, why don't you write American poems, American poems section, which is wonderful. And I'm wondering, did you write with that project in mind? Like, I'm going to have a childhood section, I'm going to have a this section and a this section. Is that how the book came into being?
No, not at all. I think I started, actually, the first poems I wrote were the poems of the middle section. And the poems of the middle section was, in a way, the reason I started writing. I had writing poetry. Yeah. I felt incredibly guilty leaving Romania, not for leaving my family, but for leaving those children I had been working with. It took me a very, very long time to gain their trust. It took me about 2 years, went through hell, and they had every single reason in the world not to trust me or anyone. They had been betrayed again and again. And so they entrusted me with their stories and their lives, and leaving them felt like the greatest betrayal of my life. Wow. And I knew I wanted, I started writing not because I wanted to write poetry. I wanted to write about those lives. I started writing out of guilt, really. And I felt I owed something to those children. And so those are the first poems. And some of them started as prose poems. Almost all of them started as third-person poems. And it took me a long time to bring those third-person poems into first-person poems and adopt those voices. The Romanian-born French philosopher and essayist Émile Cioran said that anyone who writes or speaks for another or in the name of another is always an imposter. And I have to say I agree to that to a large extent. Talking in the name of the subaltern, talking in the name of those who do not have a voice feels, doesn't feel right. But at the same time, I felt it was my responsibility to take that risk and be the imposter. I'm fine with being the imposter as long as I can tell their stories.
Well, a lot of poetry of witness? Isn't that really the role, to give voice to those who might not have the opportunity to speak for themselves?
Absolutely, yes.
As an American reading the book, it was enlightening for me. And that I was talking during the break with you, saying the second section, the middle section, really it sucker punched me. It really was like, wow, it really had a great effect. So I wonder, in your thinking as a Romanian writer who's writing in English, is there an element of, I need to witness? But to write, that you have an obligation to tell these stories. Do you feel that?
I do, absolutely. I feel like I have an obligation toward myself as well. But yes, I feel I do have that obligation. The same way, I feel the same way about translation, really. I started translating. I was convinced when I came to the States, I was convinced that I was going to be a scholar. And I finished my doctorate and I was working on...
Which was on translation, correct?
On translation theory and immigration literature. And I was working on all these theories about Roma culture and their place in post-colonial theory and so on. And I never thought I would write poetry or translate. But when I decided I was going to stay here, I was going to live in the States, and I realized at that point I would probably never return for Romania for good. I felt that responsibility, not in any huge, grandiose sense that I owed this to my country, but I felt responsible in a way toward those writers whose work I loved in Romania. I felt responsible for bringing some of their work into English, and I felt responsible. I felt it was my role to bring some of those stories into the American culture and into the American language.
What is it, the difference, or what does it feel like to be writing in English rather than in Romanian?
It's a very different process. I don't think, I never wrote poetry in Romanian.
No, never. Have you tried?
No.
Or No,
I started writing directly in English. I write my journal in Romanian. So English was the language of secrecy. When I was in Romania, I was writing my journal in English, and now I write my journal in Romanian, and I write poetry in English. It's a very different kind of experience, filtered through the English language. I think I experience my life differently.
Do you experience, when you move through life on a daily basis, are you thinking in English? This is now your default language?
For the most part, yes. Some days I think I wake up thinking in Romanian, and those are what I call the bad days for English. And but for the most part, yes, I think directly in English.
Wow, that's interesting. As someone who speaks very bad French, the idea of even attempting to write in a second language to me is really impressive. Actually,
I think it gives you a different kind of liberty, and my poetry is in no way risque, but I can curse in English, like we say as like a truck driver. In English, you say it like a sailor, right? But I can't do it in Romanian. So I feel the English language gives me the kind of license. Even in terms of approaching certain subject matters and approaching and exploiting, in many ways, exploring my private life that the Romanian language doesn't give me.
So you're kind of one step away, right? You're one step outside, possibly. Yeah, and you do translation as well, don't you?
I do translate, yes. I do translate from the Romanian into English. poetry.
Now, what's that like for actually translating another poet?
It's very exciting, and it helps me. I very often when I have a dry period, when I don't write, I engage with the process of translation, and very often I use those translations as prompts for my own writing. Sometimes staying long enough with one of the Romanian poets in the Romanian language is actually gonna bring something or make something surface in my own life that is then gonna segue in a way into the English language and into a poem.
Sure. So the translating actually feeds your work rather than pulling you away from it?
Yes. Both ways, yes.
Now, do you translate on your own or do you translate with a partner?
I translate with my husband, poet Michael Waters, and I do the first translations. I do the literal translations, and then we work together on turning those rough translations, those literals, into poems, into poetry.
Ah, interesting. Interesting. Now, you said earlier, actually, that you've only been writing poetry for a short period of time. What exactly was it that kind of flipped you from prose and scholarly writing into poetry? Was it the desire to write and tell these stories? Because wouldn't that be narrative? Wouldn't that be, I should write a nonfiction book about my time working with these kids?
Probably a number of experiences, a number of things at the same time. I living with a poet, and I
Just walking around spouting off poems all the time.
Really, I mean, I started reading poetry voraciously, and I'm a very indiscriminate reader of poetry. I read everything. I read all the journals. I try to stay even with books I don't like. And so I started reading poetry, and I got a very quick appreciation of poetry and what a poem can do. And I fell in love. Also, I fell in love with language, with the English language through poetry and through music. What happened, I was working on my dissertation in the late 90s, and actually it was late 90s, early 2000, 2002, 2003. And whenever I needed a break, whenever those theoretical frameworks were starting to burn holes in my brain, I would turn that break into a poetry session, and I always had a poem minimalized at the bottom of my screen.
Oh, wow.
So sometimes I would be immersed in all those theoretical constructs, for 3 or 4 hours, and then for a break I would have the poem pop up and work a little bit on it.
Did those become Father Dirt?
Yes, some of those poems became Father Dirt. Some of those, early versions of those poems.
Yeah.
My first poems were incredibly overwrought. I was infatuated with the English language, and I wanted every single word to be the perfect word, and I was overwriting. I still write very much by ear. My poems have a narrative thrust. They move vertically, but I'm very interested in the line. I believe in the integrity of the line, and I believe into bringing, once the narrative is finished, bringing the music into the poem. And so those early poems were all music and were absolutely incomprehensible. I mean, I knew what I was talking about, and they had a very solid narrative, but nobody could see it.
It's so funny that you say that, because the poems in Father Dirt are so controlled and there's such restraint. So there must. Well, I wonder then, what is your writing process? As you go, do you go through a lot of revision? Do you share with people? What's your process like when you're writing?
Yes, I work through. I revise a lot, and I carry the poem. I can only work on one poem at a time. And
why do you think that is?
I'm not sure. I'd like to stay with one poem, and I'm a fairly messy person and disorganized in my private life. But I managed to bring to poetry, I think, the kind of focus and concentration that my life lacks otherwise.
This is the place of
sanity. This is the place, and this is the one thing I'm going to be focusing on for the number of months. And I carry usually the drafts with me. I take them everywhere. When I had my son 3 years ago. I would go for walks with him. I would take him in the stroller for 1-2 hours, and I always had the draft I was working on pinned to the stroller, and I would stop and revise and run back home and type in the revisions and print a new copy and go for another walk.
Go for another walk. Put the revision of the
revision,
stroller.
absolutely,
That's
up
great.
there. So I always carry, wherever I go, shopping, I always have the draft I'm working
your mom was pushing me whilst revising her poems. Did those poems make it into Father Dirt as well?
Yes, some of them are there, yes.
Oh, that's great. Unfortunately, we have to go, but it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you. And again, I was talking with Mihaela Moscaliuc, the author of the book Father Dirt. And thank you for watching the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show.